In this video, I want to introduce React and I want to build our first React application together. So React is just a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It allows us to write more modular and maintainable user interfaces as compared to just writing raw HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Eventually, we'll translate our full quiz game that we created into React, and we'll see some of the benefits that React gives us. A couple of setup notes before you get started here. Make sure you have Node installed and make sure you have your terminal environment set up and that you know how to navigate around your terminal. In the description, I'll have a link to downloading Node, and I'll also have a link to the previous video that goes through terminal. A couple of React concepts before we look at any code. React is just a JavaScript library, so it doesn't do any magic outside of things that you could already do in JavaScript. We're going to use it because it gives us a structure without us having to write all of the rendering logic. It's a JavaScript library specifically for user interfaces or specifically for views. So for the rest of your application, like your state management, your routing, it doesn't care about those. It's bring your own in terms of all of those other features. So we will add more dependencies to our project as we go, bring in other packages to help us along the way. So some concepts about React. It is declarative, meaning that we just tell React, this is what we want the page to look like, and it handles adding elements to the page, registering event listeners, modifying elements that are currently on the page. We don't have to do any of that ourselves. It is component-based, meaning that we can build these encapsulated components that can have their own state associated with them, can have their own logic associated with them. And when we write them as these encapsulated components, we're able to bring them from project to project or reuse them from page to page within our application. And if we scroll down here, we can see a couple of examples. Here we have a custom component called Hello World. All it does is put a div onto the page that says hello and some name that it's been given. And we can see it used down here, very much like an HTML element where you pass these things in as attributes. In React world, these are called props, not attributes, but a very similar concept. So in React, we will be able to kind of mix our HTML-like syntax with JavaScript in a form that is called JSX. So we're going to be using a new kind of syntax inside of our JavaScript files. So here we have some HTML, but we also have a variable that has been inserted here dynamically. And you can check out some of the other examples on this page, like they have one that's a timer, which kind of demos how you can maintain state and how you can tell React, like, hey, this div should always print out the current number of seconds, and it handles doing that. You don't have to think about reaching in to grab the div and changing its text content. I also recommend checking out some of the docs and tutorials here. So if you click on Getting Started, it'll take you to the docs, and it has a couple of installation notes, and then the main concepts here will walk you through a lot of the fundamental concepts that you need to understand to work with React. So Hello World gets you up and running with your first components. This one introduces the idea of JSX, which we were just talking about, this extended JavaScript syntax, and so on. So I recommend checking these out anytime you are struggling with a concept in React. And I've got a quick code sandbox here, which this code sandbox is just an online editor for web projects. It gives you a VS Code-like environment here in the cloud. I'm just using it for a quick demo here. I'll have this linked in the description if you want to check it out. So here what we have is a application component that is being put on the page, and you can see it's a function that just returns some markup. So it's returning some JSX. So we've got some normal HTML elements like an H1, an H2, a paragraph, and then we have some other things that aren't HTML elements. These are custom components. I've got one defined in the file up here, a click button, and a couple that are defined in other files. So here, the click button, at a high level, it's just a function, that returns this markup here, this button. But what it does is maintain its own state. It keeps track of its clicks. It is able to increment the number of clicks so that when I click on one of these buttons, React knows to make sure to re-render that button. And if I click on a different button, so I've put 2 click buttons on the page, it has its own count that it keeps track of. So this type of thing, when we did it in our quiz game, required more lines of code and required code that was split across our HTML, our CSS, our JavaScript file. As we moved into React, we're going to be able to kind of encapsulate those all together. So now that I have a click button function here that does this sort of internal tracking of clicks, I can use it as many times as I want in this project, and I can bring it across projects. And I've got a couple of other demos here. This one keeps track of the clicks, but also changes its color as you click on it. And that is stored, instead of in this file, in a separate file. Same deal, it is a function that just returns some markup here, but it also changes the style as you go through it. And I also have this speak input where you can type in some text and have it speak.
Hi.
And the way you use that on the page is just drop this component in. All of the logic is encapsulated inside of this component, which is inside of this file. So I'm not too worried about everyone understanding this structure here. We're going to build our own components from scratch, and we'll build up the knowledge to understand what's in this. But hopefully the takeaway here is that this is going to allow us to create these nicely encapsulated chunks of code, components, that we'll be able to reuse and bring across projects. All right, let's get our first project set up. And we are going to use a tool called Create React App. If you Google it, I'll have this link in the description. createreactapp.dev has a lot of documentation around this tool. It is a command line interface that allows us to quickly scaffold out a React project. We could totally do this from scratch. We don't want to get bogged down in that right now. So what I'm going to do is open up my teaching folder where I've been keeping all of these together. Application design, week 3. And I'm going to open up my terminal here. I just want to make sure that my directory where I'm currently located, let me print that out here, is in my week 3 folder. So we're going to execute a command that's going to create a new project in here. So the command is npx create react app react quiz game use npm. So breaking this down, npx is a command that allows us to go use a tool called npm, the Node Package Manager, to run a package, create React app, and then the rest of this is configuration that we're giving to create React app. So npx create React app goes and pulls down that package, runs it. This second parameter that we pass in here is the name of the folder we want to create. So we want to create a folder called React Quiz Game, and we want to tell it to use npm instead of yarn, which is its default. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this, and we can see that once that starts, we should see over here a React Quiz Game folder created, and it's going to start to be filled with a bunch of files and packages. So I'm going to pause the video. This will take maybe a minute to get set up. And we're back. So you can see that it ran a whole bunch of things, installed a bunch of packages, and then at the end it printed out a message of like, oh, okay, we're done. Here are the commands. You can run npm start to start up your server. You can build your application. You can test it. So right now what we want to do is move into our React Quiz Game and open it up in Visual Studio. I'm going to do this from my terminal, but you could also just click on it and open in code here. So I'm going to cd into React Quiz Game, and then I'm going to execute code period to say open this directory inside of Visual Studio. And it opened up a extra window of an unsaved file. That won't happen for you. Okay, so I can close my terminal and just focus on Visual Studio. So this has filled in a lot of files into this project, and we're going to walk through a couple of them. But first, let's just get our application building and running. To do that, we're going to need terminal, because we're going to run a terminal command. So there are a couple ways you can do this. You can hit Control backtick to pop up your terminal window down here, or you can go to Terminal, New Terminal, or you can View Terminal here. However you do it, what you want to do is make sure that you configure your default terminal. So select default shell here, and it'll pop up the ones that you have installed. I want to make sure that mine is using git bash, which is what we set up in the terminal video, so that I can see bash here, and if I run commands like pwd or ls, those will work in my bash environment inside of Visual Studio. Okay, so this terminal window is open in our React quiz game folder, and I can run commands like npm run start. So npm run start uses the npm command line tool to run a custom script called start that's in our project. So I'm going to let this run, and then we'll figure out where this comes from in a second. And when this kicks off, so I'm flipping back to Visual Studio, it will open up your game, your application in the browser, and it will also have a little message here like this is where it's hosted. It's on localhost 3000, and here's how you could access it on your network from another device. And here it is, running in my browser. We can see that it's on localhost 3000. And if I bring these side by side, if I go into source app.js and look at my component here, we can add like an H1, my first React app, give it a save, and see that that live reloads here, and we can see that showing up on our page. So this is going to be our development process as we're going forward. We're going to make sure that we have our project running in a shell in our bash terminal down here, so that then when we make these changes, they're live reloaded on a local server here. So we're leaving live server, that extension we were using before, behind, and now our tooling is going to take care of starting up a server for us. Okay, so we've got our project here. Every time I make a change and save it, it changes over here. Let's take a quick tour of the files that we've got in this project. So it comes with a README, which has information from Create React App on how to use it. So this is a good resource to read through. Your package.json is a really important file that expresses what the dependencies of your application are. So this says we need React version 17.0.1 or an equivalent version that matches this 17.0. Or not equivalent, a more recent version that matches this 17.0. Oh, actually, no, wait, sorry. Let me rephrase that. So the caret here means that we are expressing we want version 17.01 or greater that still starts with 17. Don't worry if that's confusing for now. Just keep in mind that what this is expressing is our dependencies with the specific versions that we need of those dependencies. And it's also expressing some command line scripts that we can run. So that start command that we ran when we said npm run start is actually running this. So it's using one of our dependencies, React scripts, and telling it to start. If I kill this, so I just hit the trash icon to stop my server. If I flip back to my browser here and try to reload, it's going to fail because my server is no longer running. That's completely fine. Let's run one of these other commands. So if I run, oh, Visual Studio has frozen on me. 1 second. Let's let it reopen. Okay, we're going to open it up manually. Fun stuff that happens when you're recording tutorials. Okay, so we were looking at our commands here. We've run start by saying npm run start. If we say npm run build, that runs this one. If we say npm run test, that runs that one. Eject runs that one. So npm run build is another command that we're going to use here. And what it does is create an optimized build of our application. So one of the things to keep in mind as we're shifting into the sort of modern development tools is that the code that we are authoring here is not valid code or is not code that's ready to be given over to a browser. A browser doesn't understand JSX, so what we have to do is transpile our code and bundle it up to a kind of optimized version that browsers are ready for. And so when I ran that build command, what it did is create this build folder, which has a version of our application that is ready to go and be served up. So we could take this and put it on a server, specifically just this build folder, and have our application hosted online. We'll talk about deploying later, but I just want you to be aware when we run these commands, they're coming from this script section of package.json. We also have this package lock.json, which is related to our package.json. Our package.json expresses what dependencies we have and what versions they have. Our package lock actually goes through and says what exact versions of each dependency are we using, and those dependencies, what versions are they using, and so forth, so that we actually have this massive file here that expresses all of the specific dependencies so that if we ever install this project on a new computer, we can be sure to get the same exact versions we were using previously. We have git ignore, which we'll talk about that when we get to git. And then we have two folders here. We have a source folder and a public folder. Our source folder is our all of the source of our application that is going to then be bundled up in our build. So it's going to have our components, our styling, our images, anything that we want to kind of include in our project we'll generally be putting in this source. And it has an index, and then it has a couple of components. Actually, it just has one component here. It has the app and some CSS that goes along with it. We're going to blow all of this away and start from scratch and build up our knowledge. So don't worry if you don't know what all of these do just yet. And then our public folder here has some assets that aren't our source files, but are other files that we want to include in our build. So these get copied over into our build file, like our favicon and index.html. So if you want to change the title of your application, you can do that here. Manifest, your logos, so you can configure some of the other files that get copied over into your build by editing the public folder. And then there's our node modules folder. So this has all of those dependencies that we saw that our application is using installed on our computer. You can see there's a whole lot that come along for the ride with Create React App when we get started. And one important note, if you say put this in GitHub and clone it to your machine later, that this node modules folder is something we generally don't put into our version control and is something that may be missing from projects. Like if you download solutions in this class to projects or starter files, the node modules won't be included. And that's fine. All you have to do when you encounter a project that has node modules is before you start using it, you run npm install, which is going to read your package and package lock and install all of the necessary dependencies. So I'm going to cut this video off here. We've gotten our first application up and running. We've been able to edit it and see it change live. We've been able to build it. So we've got those production ready assets if we wanted to host it. And remember that it's important to have your node modules installed and make sure that when you want to see your application, you open up a terminal in this project and run npm run start. In the next video, we will keep working in this project and we will learn some of the concepts that we talked about in this video about JSX and building components, but we'll do them in a hands-on way. So we'll build some components from scratch.